Hi, I'm Jonathan Galea, a lawyer from Malta, and I'm the Managing Director of Blockchain Advisory Ltd. And apart from advising projects taking place out of Malta, such as ICOs, STOs, crypto funds and crypto exchanges, we have also been advising the government of Malta and the Malta Financial Services Authority in terms of the regulatory framework that has just been drawn up in Malta. So Bitmalta is the first non-profit association in Malta which has been created to advocate blockchain cryptocurrencies in Malta. We're ultimately primarily set up to ensure that, again, regulation in Malta follows a favorable direction and that it regulates the sector rather than restricts it. Our next few projects are now, of course, to, again, further educate the public about blockchain cryptocurrencies and, of course, ensuring that Malta is one of the leading jurisdictions for any blockchain-related and cryptocurrency businesses. Well, I guess the most recent victory, if you want to call it that, is that Malta is one of the first jurisdictions to actually introduce regulation in this sector in the world. So apart from regulating exchanges, ICOs, brokers and so on, Malta is actually the first country to have a regulatory authority set up which will audit and certify blockchain-based applications and platforms. So again, this is the first country in the world to actually have an authority which caters as well for the technical aspect. As I mentioned earlier on in the panel, the one thing which the crypto community has to keep in mind is that it doesn't lose its identity. The crypto community has been there for years, it has flourished, it has grown, and it should never lose its identity because, again, that will be the way that the future will actually shape up. We'll have more decentralization in place, we'll have control over our money, control over our own information, and again, all this has flourished from the crypto community. So again, the one thing that the crypto community has to keep in mind is that it has to educate other people and it has to continue growing while never, of course, forgetting the place from which it departed. I would say that the identity of the crypto community is, again, what ultimately sparked off through Bitcoin. Decentralization, having no central authority to which one is answerable, having control over our own money, over our own information, doing away with the middlemen who, again, sometimes just leech money and are just there to act extra layers of bureaucracy. So all these things are factors which one has to keep in mind when talking about the crypto community. And again, this is what the crypto community should stand for, and it should continue, of course, advocating such elements in the next years to come as well, especially due to the fact that governments, regulatory authorities and other entities, some of them might not have the best of intentions and they will try and, again, restrict the space rather than help it grow. One of the main ideas which I'd like to promote is that we're actually on the very verge of a new technological revolution. So the internet took around 50 to 60 years to actually become mainstream, and people are expecting Bitcoin, blockchain, cryptocurrencies to become mainstream over the span of 10 years, which again, we need to set our expectations accordingly. We need to keep in mind that this will be a very long and slow process, actually quicker than the internet revolution, thanks of course to the internet itself, which is helping this revolution grow at a very fast pace. But one thing to keep in mind, and one thing which I like repeating, is that we're still at the very start of it all. We're still in pretty much the embryonic phases, and anyone who's part of the space at this moment in time is basically the forefather of this new technological revolution. It's very important to keep in mind that the law has to follow technology and not the other way around. So yes, the law will always be conservative in terms of any technological breakthroughs taking place, simply because the law always has to follow technology. And whereas one can regulate this sector in a neutral manner, there will always be some things which, again, either through a technological breakthrough or through an oversight by the regulator, one will realize that they're either not regulated or inadequately regulated. So again, it's always a catch-up game to be played by the regulators. What one can do is, of course, try and regulate this in a principles-based manner rather than a rules-based manner, which means, of course, creating a framework that gives some form of leeway. And again, there's some form of interpretation which can take place for any new technological breakthroughs. If I were to worry about the consequences of my action, then 5 years ago when I started, telling people about Bitcoin, they started calling me crazy and saying, that it's just, some form of, geeks game which will never take off. Then I would have just stopped there and then. I mean, I myself, I don't really care about what other people say. I've always moved to the beat of my own drum, as they say. And again, I'm very happy to see that others nowadays are sort of now looking back on those days when I used to advocate cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin, now they're telling me, listen, you are right. I don't really take pride in being right at that time. All I'm happy about is that ultimately things are moving in the right direction, and whether it's taking them 5 years or whether it takes them 1 year, then ultimately, if everyone's moving in the same direction together, then that's what makes me happy. It's difficult to say which, again, projects or events are most important. Again, events like these, so the Coinsbank cruise, are definitely very important towards, again, spreading awareness and showing, that big things are happening in the space. But when it comes to actual projects, I think that one can't really pick any project which is more important than the other. Of course, we have certain big projects like Bitcoin itself, Ethereum, Litecoin, EOS, and so on, which again are basically the leading project in the space. But keep in mind that certain technological breakthroughs have happened through very small projects which nowadays are perhaps dead, but which should be given their own importance. So for example, the move that Ethereum is going to make from proof of work to proof of stake, this is something which has been done in a very small and obscure project around 4 years ago called Mintcoin. They were the first project to move from proof of work to proof of stake. Some lessons have been learned from that project. Nowadays, no one knows about Mintcoin anymore, but ultimately, that's what I mean, that every project has to be given its own importance, and no spark is small enough to light the new revolution. I think it's very important to keep in mind that when explaining Bitcoin, I would say that it's almost not useless as such, but one shouldn't be lost in the details. I mean, explaining about private keys, explaining about elliptical curve multiplication, all these very complex concepts, ultimately what the man on the street needs to know is that they can use Bitcoin to basically own their financial freedom, and that they can use it to transact anywhere in the globe without any restrictions. Now, if we were to get lost on those details, then mainstream adoption will be much slower, and ultimately the man on the street doesn't need to know what blockchain technology is or how it works or how private keys work and so on, because ultimately when one uses Facebook, the internet and so on, one doesn't really know about TCP, IP and HTTP and other protocols. They just use it. So again, we shouldn't get lost in the details, but we should really focus on the uses and how these will affect, of course, the man on the street. Unfortunately, there's been quite a few scams taking place in the past couple of years, so education still remains key. However, there's a difference between education when you go and invest in something, when you're putting your own money on the line, and education when it comes to usage. When it comes to usage, of course, you have to be aware of what the benefits are and what the disadvantages are, and then you make your own decision. But ultimately, there's a much higher threshold of education if you go and invest in certain projects. So what I do advise people out there who are listening, of course, is that if you're going to invest in a project, I mean, ultimately, it's your own money on the line. If you treat your own money in the same way that you throw it away at any given instance, and you like to throw away your money in any ICO, which you don't research properly, then that's your problem. But if you want to ensure that, again, you invest your money in the right place and so on, ultimately you have to make your own decision, and there's no other better person to give you advice than yourself. So you have to educate yourself, do your own research, and then decide accordingly if you want to invest in any ICO, for example. I think first and foremost has to be those projects which serve some form of public good. So if we're talking about projects which are being built on private blockchains and which, again, they basically can be done through other mechanisms, through other technologies, then again, be very careful about investing in such projects, because it might just be that they're doing so just for their financial gain. However, there's a project which is being pushed through a non-profit foundation, which serves a public good, and again, which tries and solve some particular technological problem, which perhaps Bitcoin isn't able to do, or Ethereum and so on, then those projects are worthy of attention. Always look into who is behind the project, do your due diligence on each and every person involved in that project, and again, look out for certain red flags which might alert investors to some potential scam. The golden rule to follow is basically, if it's too good to be true, then it normally is. So again, just use your common sense when doing your research and when investing in projects. Again, I would say, I said this before, and I might just repeat it now as well. If someone tells you that, that basically cryptocurrencies are a bubble and that, blockchain is useless and so on, I mean, keep in mind that if it weren't for the fact that someone tried to, again, push cars and sell cars to users who, again, were happy with horses and they just wanted a faster horse, then if they had given up, then we wouldn't have cars nowadays. So right now, we're looking at the new car. People are still using horses. They just want faster horses, but we're trying to sell the new car to them. And of course, they'll find complaints. They say, listen, a car is much more expensive to run. A car will break down anywhere and I won't have help with it if it just decides to break down. They'll come up with all sorts of excuses. We just have to continue persevering. We just have to keep in mind the core principles and what blockchain technology stands for. And in the end, whether it takes 2 years, 5 years, or 50 years, I'm pretty sure that everyone will, again, be on the same side, and they'll look back on these days as the first early days for blockchain technology, which will shape the future to come. To look at the ecosystem as a whole, I think two main things will develop in the next couple of years. First of all, certain use cases for blockchain technology which go beyond fundraising and ICOs. Again, there's a lot of dApps being developed, but then again, we haven't heard of any success story in the dApp industry so far, which has, again, been used in the mainstream. If we look at Ethereum right now, the biggest commercial, let's say, event on Ethereum which took place apart from the ICOs was precisely CryptoKitties. Does it mean that Ethereum is only useful for CryptoKitties? Of course not. It goes far beyond that. But I think in the next few years, we'll certainly see certain dApps developing, and one of them might be, again, a star hit. Who knows? The second thing which will develop in the next few years is, of course, regulation on a global level. So we have countries which already dipped their toes, like Malta, Liechtenstein, and so on. But there will be other countries who will also try to regulate the space. Will they regulate it successfully? Again, we'll still have to see. I mean, even for Malta, we are the first mover in this space. Will it be a success story? Hopefully so. We've done our homework, we've done our due diligence, but ultimately we might have just gotten it wrong. So we have to see whether it's a success in the next few years. So yes, I mean, regulation, development, they will hopefully move hand in hand. And if there's any conflict between those two, then hopefully it will get resolved as soon as possible, because ultimately technology has to be the first priority, and then regulation should follow technology.